Hello, friends. To begin our math lesson today, we are going to start with a equal sharing problem, a review from Monday. So if you have a piece of paper and a pencil in front of you, I would like you to solve. This says 10 preschoolers shared 2 liters of fruit juice equally during morning snack. How much juice did each student get? Draw a picture and diagram to explain your thinking. 2 things you want to be asking yourself while you're solving. Can everybody get a whole? And how many people are sharing? Okay, so if you take a look at how I solved this problem, the first thing that I did was I showed the 10 preschoolers, and I labeled them A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, and J. Okay, the next thing that I showed was my 2 liters of fruit juice, so that I showed 2 wholes and represented them with 2 rectangles. After that, I divided each whole into tenths because I realized that not everyone can get a whole because there was only 2 wholes and we have 10 preschoolers. So I had to ask myself how many people are sharing. I know that 10 people are sharing, so that is why I decided to divide the whole into tenths. When I divided each whole into tenths, I noticed that each preschooler would be getting 2/10 of a liter of fruit juice. Another way that you could have solved was you could have thought, well, I know that 10 people are sharing, and I know I have 2 wholes. I know that 10 divided by 2 is 5. So if I split 1 whole into fifths, right? If I split each whole into 5 equal parts, each preschooler would be getting 1/5 of a liter of juice. Okay, so you could have solved this either way. 2/10 and 1/5 are equivalent fractions, so both are the correct answer. Today we are going to be talking a little bit about decimals, specifically tenths and hundredths. Fractions with multiples of 10 as a denominator, so fractions that have a denominator of 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, and so on, can be written as decimals. Okay, so we're going to review our decimal place value. So when we are writing decimals, the whole comes before the decimal point, then we have the decimal point, and after the decimal point is the fractional part. And our first place value to the right of the decimal point is tenths, and the next one is hundredths. So let's talk about tenths. So when you're thinking about tenths, I want you to think about the longs in a flat. Okay, so how many longs would you need to cover the whole flat or to cover this whole grid? Now this grid is made of 100 boxes. So how many longs are we going to need to cover the whole grid? Right, you're going to need 10 longs. And if I was to sit here and drag all of my longs over this grid, we would see that 10 of them would cover the whole grid. Right? So with that being said, what fraction of the grid is 1 long? So look at this representation here. What fraction of the grid is 1 long? Yep, so 1/10 is equal to 1 long. Okay, and how can we write this as a decimal? We can write 1/10. We can write 1/10 as a decimal like this. 1/10, we have 0 wholes, then our decimal point, and we have 1/10. Now we're going to talk about hundredths. So when you're thinking about hundredths, I want you to think about boxes. Okay, there are 100 boxes that make up this flat. So how many boxes does it take to cover the whole grid? It's going to take 100 boxes. So what fraction is 1 box? Right, it would be 1/100th. So 1 box is 1/100th of the whole grid, right? And what is this decimal, or how would we write 1/100th? 0 wholes. We have 0 tenths. We don't have any longs. and we have one box. We have 100th. And to read this, it is 0 and 100th. So when we're going from fractions to decimals, if you take a look at the fraction circle here, you're going to notice that 2/10 of the circle are shaded. So we want to express this as a decimal, and we can because the denominator is a multiple of 10. All right, so this fraction circle is representing there's no holes, there's 0 holes, and there are 2/10 shaded. So that's how we would represent 2/10 as a decimal. And to read this decimal, it's read as 2/10. Now let's take a look at this fraction circle representation. So we see that we have one whole and then we have 2/10 of the whole. If we were to write this as a mixed number, it would be 1 and 2/10. And to write it as a decimal, we are going to write it as we have one whole and then we have 2/10 of a whole. Okay, let's continue to practice converting tenths to decimals. Okay, so I'm going to do the first few and then you guys are going to have the opportunity to fill in the rest of the table. So the first one says 1/10. To write that as a decimal, we have 0 holes. We're going to put our decimal point and we have 1/10. Now this decimal is reading 2/10. So to write that as a fraction, we simply write 2/10. 3/10 would be written as 0 and 3/10. I want you to try writing 6/10 as a fraction, 8/10 as a decimal, and 9/10 as a decimal. Great, so 6/10 as a fraction would be written as 6/10. 8/10 as a decimal would be written as 0 and 8/10. And 9/10 as a decimal would be written as 0 and 9/10. Okay, let's take a look at some of our problems over here. Which is larger, 4/10 or 6/10? If you said 6/10 is larger, you are correct. Okay, I noticed that if you were to compare using, by just looking at place value and write them vertically, stack your numbers that you're comparing, and start from left to right, you would see that you have a 0 in the ones place, or you have 0 holes. And then if you compare the tenths place, 6 is greater than 4, so you know that 6/10 is greater than 4/10. Okay. Try this one. 11 and 1/10 and 12 and 1/10. Which one is greater? If you said 12 and 1/10, you are correct. Again, if you were to stack these numbers vertically, you would notice that the tens place is the same, right? Both numbers have a 1 in the tens place. When you move on to the ones place, you see that the 2 is greater than the 1, so you know that 12 and 1/10 is greater than 11 and 1/10. All right, now we are going to practice writing fractions as decimals. In this case, these fractions are written at over hundredths. Okay, so the first one says 14/100ths. When we write 14/100ths as a decimal, we have 0 holes, we have 1/10, and 4/100ths. Okay, 0 and 14/100ths. Now 28/100ths would be written as 28 over 100. 56/100ths would be written as 0, and I have 5/10 and 6/100ths. 0 and 56 hundredths. I want you to try writing 5 hundredths as a fraction, 8 hundredths as a decimal, and 90 hundredths as a decimal. Okay, so 5 hundredths written as a fraction would be 5 over 100. 8 hundredths would be written as 0. We don't have any tenths. We have 0 tenths and we have 8 hundredths. Okay, I'm thinking about what this would look like on my hundreds grid. Okay, so if I just go back to the other slide quickly, if I wanted to represent 8 hundredths on my hundredths grid, I can shade 1, 2, 3. Right, this would represent 8 hundredths, this shading, if I was to shade it a little bit better. Okay, if you notice, I don't have a long, and we know that longs are equivalent to tenths, so I don't even have a tenth, right? So as I'm writing that decimal, it would be 0 and 8 hundredths. I just have 8 boxes shaded. All right, and 90 hundredths would be written as 0 and 90 hundredths. Now, 0 and 90 hundredths is equivalent to 0 and 9 tenths. These are equivalent decimals. Okay, because 90 hundredths, again, if we go back to our grid, I'll use this one. 90 hundredths would be 90 of our boxes shaded in. So I'm at 30, 40, 50. Right? So that's 90 boxes, which is equal to 9 longs, or 9 tenths. All right, let's practice a few more. So for this one, 20 hundredths, we want to figure out how many tenths, how many hundredths, and then write it as a decimal. You will have the opportunity to do some of these. So in this example, 20 hundredths, I have 2 tenths, I have 0 hundredths, and to write this as a decimal, I would write it as 0 and 20 hundredths. Okay. 45 hundredths, I have 4 tenths, I have 5 hundredths. To write this as a decimal, I would do 0 and 45 hundredths. 4 hundredths. 4 hundredths, I have 0 tenths, I have 4 hundredths. To write it as a decimal, it would be 0 and 4 hundredths. Okay, you are going to try this next one on your own. 19 hundredths. Yep, 19 hundredths. You have 1 tenth. 9 hundredths. To write it as a decimal, it would be 0 and 19 hundredths. Try 23 hundredths. 23 hundredths. Yep, so 23 hundredths, you have 2 tenths, you have 3 hundredths, and to write it as a decimal, it would be 0 and 23 hundredths. Okay. Last question, and then you're going to be off to independent practice. What would 1/5 be as a decimal? So I'm taking a look at this fraction, and the first thing that I notice is that the denominator is 5. And at the beginning of the lesson, we said that fractions with multiples of 10, that means fractions with denominators of 10 100, 1,000, and 10,000 can be written as decimals. Now, this fraction has a 5 in the denominator. So the way that this fraction is written right now, it can't be written as a decimal because a 5 is in the denominator. So what we're going to need to do is we need to find an equivalent fraction for 1/5 that has a denominator of 10. Okay, so think about our equivalent fraction rule. Find an equivalent fraction for 1/5 that has a denominator of 10. All right, so the first thing I would probably do is I might set up 1/5 times what number equals something over 10. Well, I know that 5 times 2 equals 10, right? And my equivalent fraction rule says that whatever I do to the denominator, I have to do to the numerator. They need to be multiplied by the same number. So if I multiplied by 2 in the denominator, I'm going to multiply by 2 in the numerator. And 1 times 2 is 2. So 1/5 is equal to 2/10. So what would 1/5 be as a decimal? Well, if I was to write 2/10 as a decimal, it would be 0 and 2/10. Today you are going to be working on a Google form to show your understanding of converting fractions to decimals and decimals to fractions, in addition to solving the problem of the day.